Hey guys, here today showing you how to how to remove the upper plenum on a F-Series Accord motor. This is a 2002 Accord with a F23A4 motor, which is the SULEV, super ultra low emission vehicle. But this process is pretty much the same for any F-Series motor, F22s, F23s. You get the idea. Pretty much any motor from an Accord or any single cam Prelude engine will pretty much have a manifold that looks like this. Now I'm taking this off because I'm getting an EGR insufficient flow code, which is also extremely common with these. So actually this video I guess could show you how to alleviate that problem, which is a check engine light code P0401. Pretty much what happens is the passages that go from the EGR here that flow into the manifold get extremely clogged with carbon and pretty much just nasty looking black soot stuff that gets clogged up. Keep in mind this is not a 100% fix for this. The proper way to fix this code would be to remove the entire intake manifold so that you can clean out all the passages as good as you can. That's what I would be doing. However, this car, I'm just gonna try and, I've done them this way where I just take off this upper plenum and then use a hanger to clean out the passages, and most of the time it works. About 80% of the time it works. But keep in mind the correct way would be to pull off the entire intake manifold, which I'm not gonna do today. I'm just going to pull off this upper portion here. You will need various set of hand tools, Phillips screwdriver, a set of pliers to take off hose clamps. Looks like 10 millimeter, 14 millimeter. You may need a 12 millimeter, but I honestly don't remember this all off the top of my head. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through it as I go through it. But yeah, you would also need some brake cleaner, a metal wire hanger if you have one, or something like that, something that's thin and flexible enough that you can stick it through a small hole and work it around to clean out a passage. So the first thing we want to do is to remove this air intake tube here that's going in. It's connected to the air box simply just by pulling it off. Down here on the intake manifold there's this Phillips screwdriver. You may very well have a socket here. That's probably going to be a 5.5 millimeter socket head usually, but this one is just Phillips, so I'll just loosen it up for now just so that we can take this intake tube off. Then next you want to do is to remove the breather hose here, the hose clamp. And then this will pretty much just pull right, it'll just pull right out of here like this. I don't know if you can see that in the camera, but this little hose here, it'll just pull straight out of the intake tube. And then you can go on ahead and remove the intake tube from the airbox side. Just push it straight down, it'll come off. And then you can go on ahead and just pull the intake tube out of its place. Make sure that the wiring harness is disconnected and any other hoses that are connected to it are off. And then here you just pretty much set this aside. Now the next thing you want to do is to disconnect any electrical connectors that are connected to the manifold, which will be here, the map sensor on the top. You just unplug that one. There's also a blue plug that's on the back for the throttle position sensor. It's right here in the back. You'll see it with the flashlight. It's kind of hard to, it's not really hard to reach. You just grab it and pull it off. I don't know if you can see it right here, me wiggling it there in the camera. You just also disconnect that. There's also another connector on the very end over here. This is the intake air temperature sensor right on the end of the top of the upper manifold. Unplug that. Then there's the hardest one to get to, and actually the easiest way to get to it is to remove the brake booster hose first. There's a brake booster hose that's right here on top. You can just use pliers to move the clamp. Then you can go on ahead and just pull the brake booster hose off, just like so, and then just set it down. You can just tuck it up here by the brake line for now. Now you can reach the IAC valve, the idle air control valve that's on the back. There's a connector there. Go ahead and disconnect that one. Okay, now there are two vacuum lines that are up here for the evap. Just remember which one goes where. I have this one right here in the front marked white so I know where it goes, but you can go ahead and remove both those as well. You can just set both those aside. Okay, there's another connector here that you want to loosen up, which is for the evap purge solenoid. It's right here in the very front. There's one connector right here, right underneath the throttle cable. You can go ahead and disconnect that one. Now we can go on ahead and disconnect the throttle cables. What you'll need to do is to push down. You push down to open up the throttle completely, and then you'll have to fish the cables out. You pretty much just push them out of their holes. Pretty much, you'll have to look at it to understand how it comes out. It's pretty easy though. That's one of them out. And that's the second one out. Now you can go on ahead and loosen up the bracket that holds the throttle cables. There are two 10mm bolts right here in front. After you loosen up the throttle cable, go on ahead and just kind of just maneuver it out of the way. Just set it to the side for now. Now what we want to do is to loosen up the purge solenoid, which is this connector right here in the very front that you took off. Sorry that this fuel line is in the way, but there's the purge valve is right here in front. We don't need to disconnect it from anything really, just the two 10mm bolts that are holding it on each side. We do need to loosen those up and take them out. That way that the purge valve is not connected to the upper manifold anymore. So we do just want to loosen those up and take them off. Okay, now that that's loose, you will notice, now it depends on how your vacuum hose is attached, but this purge valve that you just loosened up, there's a hose that comes in on one side from the right side, and then there's a hose that comes out and goes into the manifold here. Depending on what kind of clamp is on that hose that goes into the manifold, you will decide which clamp you want to take off, because we do need to disconnect the hose so that the whole purge valve doesn't come up when we take out the manifold. I'm going to choose to take off this side because it just has a regular hose clamp, and it'll be easier for me to deal with that. Okay, I got that disconnected, so I'll be ready to go now. Now, this other part can be a little tricky because you probably will be losing some coolant. You will be losing some coolant because this coolant has to flow into this idle air control valve. Directly underneath the throttle body here, where you took off the intake pipe, there is a small hose. It's a coolant hose. It goes into the fast idle valve. So we do have to disconnect that and pull it out. You're probably going to lose some coolant, so it's recommended to put like a drain pan, something underneath the car. That way you don't spill it all over the ground. I will say that if you happen to have hose clamps, by hose clamps I'm meaning this tool, you squeezes onto the hose and stops coolant or power steering fluid or whatever you hook it to, stops it from coming out. You can go ahead and use these so you don't spill so much coolant on the ground, but if you don't have these, it's totally not a big deal. Just point the hose straight up so that coolant doesn't fall out. Okay, after you've got that lower hose taken off, you can remove the hose for the PCV valve here. You can either remove it here with the clamp on the front, or you can just pull this PCV hose straight out, which is what I do. I just pull it out like that. That way you don't have to disconnect any hose clamps, if you can. The manifold is held down by I believe there are 5 12mm bolts in one, or excuse me, there are nuts and bolts. They're all 12mm. There's 3 here in the front, and then there's 2 that are kind of, well, you can reach for them in the back. That's what you're going to have to do, is just reach for them and just blindly do it. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen up these front ones. Okay, now you got the 3 off the front. There are 2 in the back. You'll just have to reach your hand back there and feel for them. One is pretty much really close to the end towards the driver's side. The other one is somewhat behind right in front of the connector for this back IAC connector that you took off earlier. You can just reach back there and feel for it. You'll be able to feel it. Okay, now that you have this loose, the last 2 bolts you'll need to remove are 2 10mm bolts that are on the very end underneath the intake air temperature sensor over here. There's 2 10mm bolts. You'll just have to loosen those up so that you loosen that bracket up right there. Okay, now that those are loose, you can go ahead and lift up the manifold. Keep in mind that it will be it'll be attached in the back. Okay, so now we see, here, let me see if I can move the camera to show you what I'm talking about here. Now, as you can see, all of that in there, all that black carbon buildup, that's what's causing the EGR flow code. This right here is the port that's supposed to be open. Right here where I'm pointing at. That is supposed to be fully open, just like you see these holes over here, you can clearly see into them. This right here is supposed to be an open port. That's where the EGR flow goes to. As you can see, there's a lot of crap in there. So that's why you're going to take your hanger and clean in here, so that we can get some of the flow back. Then this flows down here and flows right into the EGR valve. So that's pretty much what we're after right now. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I have allergies. Right now what we're going to do is to remove the EGR valve, which is just held on with 2 bolts, and you loosen up that connector right there, and then we'll actually be able to kind of fish the hanger in there and try and clean it out as best we can. So we're going to go ahead, let's go ahead and set the camera back up and then pull the EGR valve off. you will find that you need to loosen up the harness that goes across here. There's just two clips that hold it on to two brackets. You just need to lift it up enough out of the way just so you can get to this other 12mm bolt that's holding on the EGR valve. There's one on this side and one on here, on this side. After you got the two bolts loosened up, you can go ahead and just lift the EGR valve straight up off of the studs. Now you will notice that it will have some buildup also. That's on here. You need to take some brake cleaner and spray both of these ports out as best as you can. This one is going to be closed, but you can spray off all this excess carbon. This one is slightly open to allow some, that's where the bypass goes through. So you can spray in there and try and clean it up as best as you can with brake cleaner. So here I will show you where the EGR flow actually goes through and where you need to stick your hanger at or whatever you may have to clean it out. Now keep in mind, as I said, there is another port that you're not going to be able to get to. You could try to clean it, but it won't get 100% clean. So as you remember, I told you that here port right here, this one here is where the clog is at, and it follows this line. You'll see it right into the EGR here. So you need to pretty much take a hanger and clean out this port, the square port, something flexible enough to come through here and up into the manifold here and poke it out. So that way you can try and get that as clean as you can. You can also spray brake cleaner or anything like that down there, some kind of solvent, card cleaner, something like that you can will break up that soot. I usually just use brake cleaner, maybe some sea foam. You can set some sea foam in there and it'll eventually clear it out. And that's pretty much how you would get to do it. The circle hole also has a port that goes down into the head. That's why I say you need to actually take the manifold off in order to be able to clean that port out, because the port that's inside the cylinder head gets pretty clogged up also. So you can take something as well and stick it in here. As I'm looking at the engine, you want to stick it down into that circle hole and go that way towards the front of the car. There is a small hole that goes into the cylinder head, so you'll try and clean that out as best as you can as well. But as you can see, this happens on these motors so much. I can't even count how many times I've done this on my hands, because I've done it a lot. And the reason why is because this here is so clogged up with carbon. So I'm gonna go ahead and just clean that out now, and you can do the same. I mean, take as much time as you want on it, and then I'll show you how to reassemble everything back. There's a gasket that goes around the upper plenum here. You don't need to get a new one. You can just reuse the old one unless you feel like you really want to buy a new one. I know they're not very expensive, probably around $8 to $15, and you can just get yourself a new one, but I am not going to. Okay, so after you've got the port cleaned out as best as you can go ahead and just reinstall everything pretty much in the reverse of the way you took it off. You'll need to go ahead and reset the upper manifold back down on top here, and you can go on ahead and tighten up all the bolts and nuts that held it down. There are 5 of them. Okay, after you got the intake manifold bolted down, go on ahead and reinstall the EGR valve. Make sure you cleaned out the ports, as I mentioned before. You can go on ahead and tighten up the EGR valve. Kind of tight spaces for the nuts, but I should be able to maneuver it in there some as best you can. going ahead and reinstall the wiring harness back onto its clips. Now you're going ahead and reinstall the two 10mm bolts that are holding the bracket on over here. One of them was holding a bracket and the other one was holding a ground wire. Make sure you connect the ground wire 100%, and then go ahead and connect the bracket afterwards. I'm going ahead and reconnect the intake air temperature sensor connector right here on the end since you're already here. You can go on ahead and reconnect the connector in the very back, the IAC valve connector. Now you can go on ahead and reconnect that coolant hose that you did take off in the beginning that's underneath the bottom. You can reconnect both the vacuum lines, remembering where they go. The small vacuum lines that are up here on the top. You can reconnect the throttle position sensor, which was the blue connector in the very back. We can go on ahead and reinstall the brake booster hose, which goes right here on top of the manifold. And now we can go on ahead and reinstall the purge valve that's held on by two 10mm bolts as well. You can reconnect the hose, whichever hose you decided to take off. Go on ahead and reconnect that one back on now. You can reconnect this purge valve connector. You can reconnect the EGR valve connector. You can take the PCV valve and just push it back into the valve cover. Now we can go on ahead and reinstall the throttle cable. Pretty much have to feed the lines the same way you took them off. You can go on ahead and reconnect the two 10mm bolts that hold this on. Now the last thing to do is just to put the intake tube back on. You just slide it back on, and then, no, we actually need to connect the map sensor connector as well, which is right here. Then we can go on ahead and put the intake tube back on. And obviously on the opposite side, you can go on ahead and put the tube back onto the air box. Then you'll need to reinstall this breather line back into the intake. Just push it back in, simple as that. And pretty much that's all there is to it. You would need to delete your check engine light if you had the check engine light. Then you can go ahead and start up the car and drive it around again and try and set the monitors for smog. I don't know how smog is in the other states, but in California you have to have smog monitors ready, and the EGR is one of those monitors in the case of this car. So yeah, like I said, this works about 85% of the time, just cleaning out, just doing that short little cleaning. So that way you can get rid of the P0401 code. I believe that's what it is. I will definitely have the correct code in the description, but I'm pretty sure that's what the code is. So yeah, if this was helpful for you, please hit the like button, share it with your friends. If this is your first time to the channel, thanks for coming, and I hope you found this video useful as well. If you could just hit the subscribe button on your way out, I greatly appreciate that. Alright guys, until next time.